Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the Black Doctoral Workshop Series. I'm Dr. Daniels, and I will serve as today's moderator. But before we start today's session, I want to first encourage you to ask questions and definitely be engaged. You can post your questions in the chat or hold those questions until the end of the presentation. Likewise, I'd like to encourage you to complete a brief evaluation at the end of the session. So without further ado, we'll get started. The title of today's presentation is Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Implications for Higher Education. And our speaker is none other than Dr. Lawrence Bryant. Dr. Bryant brings a plethora of experiences and knowledge dealing with substance abuse disorders, HIV/AIDS prevention and education, diversity, equity, and inclusion training, anti-racism training, and sexual orientation education. He has been successful in developing and implementing a statewide strategy and plan for Georgia in response to the opioid and prescription drug overdose epidemic. Dr. Bryant has published over 20 peer-reviewed articles in the areas of HIV/AIDS, homophobia, racism, and tobacco use prevention. And he has been a registered respiratory therapist for over 45 years, fighting on the front lines of the COVID-19 epidemic. Dr. Bryant, the microphone is yours. Thank you for being here.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Daniels, for such a warm and inviting welcome. And before I get started, I really want to just reflect on this quote. No man or woman is an island unto themselves. Everyone is a part of the continent, a part of the main. Therefore, never sin to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Firstly, I want to say thank you to the Black Doctoral Network. Thank you, DeAndre, just for the powerful and the hard work that you've done over the years to really make this organization something that we, not only as African Americans, but we as a country can be thankful for it, because I just don't think there's anything quite like the Black Doctoral Network, and I've been involved for over 10 years. And so I definitely want to thank you for your hard work. Dr. Daniels, thank you for, again, a warm and welcoming, to this presentation. And I further want to thank anyone who's within the sound of my voice for doing this work, for making a commitment to this work and being steadfast. Because one thing about diversity, equity, and inclusion and race, oftentimes it's a very hard conversation to have, but nevertheless, we must begin to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, because starting today, we're going to have some uncomfortable conversations and dialogue around race. And I'm the kind of individual, we've been meeting about this topic for years. We've been talking about this topic for years. We've been sort of bypassing this topic for years, but now it's time to engage in action oriented kinds of activities, things that we can incorporate in our day-to-day activities, not just at work, but also in our communities, also in our homes, and also making a personal commitment to this work so that it becomes not just a presentation on April the 24th, 2023, no, but this becomes part of a lifelong process and commitment to social justice, to diversity, to equity, to inclusion. And as the quote that I mentioned at the onset, that no man is an island unto themselves. We are all working together, because one of the things that Martin Luther King says, that, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So we are all involved in this process. And when one falls short, it really does impact us all. And so as we move forward, really taking a closer look, really contextualizing what it is that we say and what we mean when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Is it just a cliche? Is this just something that is just sort of the buzzword or the buzz term for this particular time and era? No, this has got to be something that we make a part of our lifestyle. And again, I'm so fortunate to be a part-time assistant professor at Kennesaw University. And I'll share a little bit of my personal experience as well as my professional. I've had the privilege of being on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee at Kennesaw State University. And we've been in existence maybe about, I want to say, not quite a year. But we've made, in my estimation, some fairly good progress in terms of meeting what our goals are around diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'll share some of that with you as well. And I also am part of Wellstar College at Kennesaw State University. So each department is challenged with having a DEI department or having a DEI activities within their department. But overarching is the university-wide diversity and inclusion excellence department. So this is a actual university-wide department that oversees the smaller departments, but they have developed quite a robust curriculum for us at the university, such that it's been in it about, I guess, 5 months so far. We've got about 2 more months to go. So in June we'll be finished, but we actually will have a certificate in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so that process has really been engaging, very insightful, and very expansive. And so again, today's title, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Implications for Higher Education. So, and just in terms of our learning objectives, we're going to really look at, review, and define, as well as contextualizing what we mean by diversity, equity, and inclusion. We'll describe the importance of integrating DEI into higher education institution activities, and just our day-to-day reimagining our policies and procedures. We'll also describe leadership responsibility and promoting DEI in their organizations. And again, this is fairly small group. And so anyone at any time, if you want to come off of mute, let's just make this a small family affair, so that we are all engaged in the discussion. One of the things about myself, I don't consider myself an expert in this field. I consider myself a facilitator of knowledge, navigating, learning, and experiences. And so I want you, whoever you are, to be a part of this conversation as well. What can you contribute? What questions do you have? And what can ultimately combine to be your input in this overall dialogue and discussion that we are having? And so those are our learning objectives. And of course, you can add more if you like. Again, this is just not my presentation, but this is our presentation. So the first thing I want to do is to illuminate this very, very important executive order 14035 that was passed down by the Biden administration. So given some pretty challenging policies and dialogue around DEI from former presidents, this executive order makes a very, very valiant statement. And it says the government is behind this. It says the government is not only behind it, but willing to put resources to make sure that this is exemplified. And so the order establishes that diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility, let's not forget about accessibility, are priorities for my administration and benefits the entire federal government, not only the federal government, but also the nation. And so I don't know that we've had the top leader in the country in the past to make such an important declaration around commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion. And so this executive order 14035 really has set the standard. It set the stage because we know that in terms of policies and procedure, it really does start from the top. It starts from the top and it trickles down. So thank you to this administration that you opened this door. And once this door has been opened, now we see many, many organizations, particularly organizations of higher learning, adopting diversity, equity, inclusion, leaders within their organization, committees within their organization, resources, as well as education, in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But what we want to make sure that we are targeting are those evidence-based strategies, those strategies that have been proven efficacious within our scientific community in terms of moving diversity, equity, and inclusion forward, especially when we're talking about academia. So let's start. And the first thing that I want to talk about is, contextualizing diversity, equity, and inclusion. What do we mean when we say diversity, equity, inclusion? Again, this is not just a cliche, but this contextually has some very, very deep meanings to it. So I looked at several different definitions, and some just were not encompassing and not as expansive as I would have liked, but I like what the CDC has said in 2017. They describe diversity, equity, inclusion as an appreciation, and I want you to sort of savor each word. Appreciation, number one, and respect, number two, for the many differences and similarities in the workplace. This includes cultivating an environment, and here is what's also just as important, of fairness, inclusion, and equity. So keep that in the back of your mind. And let's move even further when we further contextualize, for example, equality versus equity. Now, there are a lot of people who say, well, I'm in an organization, I'm the CEO or leader, and I just give everyone the same thing across the board. So I am an organization, and a leader that's, practices diversity, equity, and inclusion. But we know that that's not enough. And if you look at these two apple trees and look at these 6 individuals, let's look at what equity let's look at what equality tells us. Equality says that all 3, when you look at the boxes that they are standing on, all 3 are standing on the same height level of the box. But when you see who is able to actually access the apples on the tree, there's only one person, and that's the tallest person. So person B and person C cannot get the apple off the tree. And that has significance. But when you look at the term equity, there's a difference. Equity means that we are not focused on equality, but we are focused on outcomes. And when we talk about outcomes, that means that every one of those three individuals, whatever is needed, have and deserve the right to get an apple off that tree. So for example, for the tall person, that same box is fine. But for the other two, we needed to add an additional box or an additional resource. And even for the shortest person, we had to even add an additional box on top of that. And so when we discern equality versus equity, that's what we mean. We want to make sure that all individuals actually get what it is that they need in order to be successful. And so again, please remember this term. You can take a picture of it: diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the most important thing here is cultivating an environment of fairness, inclusion, and equity. So now let's move a little bit further. And so when we look at diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's more than just about race. It's so much more than just about race. It's about a plethora of things that impact the individual, that impact the group, that impact the community. And so let's take a deeper look at this wheel, because I like this wheel. I think it's very comprehensive, but it's also very expansive. So come with me, take a closer look. So there are three salient areas that are important here. So, of course, central is the personality or the individual or group. But there are three dimensions. There's the internal dimension, of course, but then there's the external dimension. And finally, there's the organizational dimension. So let's just put on our critical thinking cap and look how expansive diversity, equity, and inclusion can be, but also things that we probably hadn't thought about before as being a part of this wheel. So of course, when we look at internal dimensions, well, there are traditional areas like age, gender, sexual orientation, physical ability, accessibility, ethnicity, and race. So we know that that is inclusive of diversity, equity, inclusion. But let's look at some of the external dimensions that we may not have thought about before. One is marital status. We know that in some organizations that can become an issue. Also income, what individuals make within the organization, but also what it affords them outside of the organization as well. Geographic location. So a rural organization or institution may have different factors in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion than, let's say, a inner city institution, or even in institutions that basically are HBCUs. And so they also impact, again, diversity, equity, inclusion. And other areas, religion and spirituality. And I tell you, I just want to spend a minute on this because, working in large organizations, practically all of my professional career, there have been some issues. There have been some issues. And I just want to say real quickly, an experience that I had just around religion and spirituality. So I was assistant professor on a tenure track at a major university here in Atlanta. And I was teaching respiratory therapy. And of course, the student body for respiratory therapy was very, very diverse. We had individuals from not just the United States, but all over the world, China, Saudi Arabia. But I was teaching one particular course. And within that course, I had a husband and wife who were Saudi, both Saudi. And the assignment that was due was for everybody within the class to give a presentation on a particular topic. Can't remember what the topic was. And so after the class, the young lady's husband Saudi husband came to me and says, well, I can't allow my wife to do a presentation in a room full of men. So I'm just not going to allow her to do the presentation. And it kind of caught me off guard. And to be honest with you, I didn't know what to do. And I said, I didn't respond right away. I said, I'll get back with you and with an answer. So I went to my chair at the time. And she was kind of puzzled too, because, she had to say, well, I need to get back with you because I need to do an investigation. And of course, I did some investigation as well. So ultimately, we came back with the decision that she still needed to do the presentation. But what they were really, really responding to wasn't necessarily a religious thing, but it was a cultural kind of thing. And so because they were here in the United States, that they really did need to conform to the course assignment. And so I told him that when I went back to have a conversation, and he said, okay. And so when his wife got up to do the presentation, I just felt some kind of way. She was nervous, she was shaking, and I just thought she was just going to have a nervous breakdown. And I hadn't anticipated that. But long story short, she did the presentation, she did a wonderful job. But a friend of mine said to me, you got to be really careful with that, particularly, culture, because you don't know what she may have experienced when she went back home with her husband. And I hadn't thought about that. I had not thought about that as a potential problem that I just didn't anticipate it. So what I said to myself after that it wasn't absolutely necessary that she do the presentation in front of everyone. And so I said that I would incorporate more flexibility in terms of, those kinds of concerns culturally or religiously. And if I could possibly accommodate, then I would. And so that was just a great lesson learned for myself. And so again, these all impact us when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. And then lastly, the organizational dimension, things that impact the organizational dimension, management status. So, what kind of status is the management, and what are their priorities in terms of the organization? Also, the division or department that you are in within the organization also may impact the diversity, equity, inclusion, as well as other things such as seniority, work location, again, and also whether or not one organization may be affiliated with a union or not. So you can see that when we look at diversity, equity, inclusion from a more expansive view, it really incorporates things that we probably hadn't thought of before, but also should be things that we consider. And so moving along. So let's break down even further just the term diversity. So having a representative number of people of color in an organization, it's critical, yes. A representative of the population that we're serving is very, very important, but it's not enough. And as we will see, there are other kinds of elements and issues that are at work here that also impact diversity. So for example, what about our leadership? Is our leadership diverse? Does it impact or reflect the population that we serve? What about the board of directors, who ultimately makes some very, very important decisions? Do the board of directors also reflect the population that's being served? So as we can see, there are a number of other elements other than just having a representative number of people within the organization. So when we look at equity again, and so, yeah, we explained equity and compare that to equality, but also just to know also that equity is about policies and it's about practices that drive outcomes. Reevaluating departmental policies, reevaluating, you say that you have a diverse equitable and inclusive department. But when you look at the data and when you stratify data, does it really reflect the population? So when we look at policies and procedures, and we'll get into that a little bit, what are your hiring practices? What are your promotion practices? And how is retention? Are we doing exit interviews? Those kinds of things. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. And again, if you have any questions, as I'm moving along, feel free. I'm certainly open to that. And here is inclusion. Inclusion centers people of color as leaders and decision makers, in addition to ensuring diverse representation. So here it is. Oftentimes, and I've been at the university I was talking about. One of the things that was just sort of frustrating to me is during graduation. This is the second largest university in Georgia. And during graduation, when I looked on the stage, and on the stage were basically the leaders and administrators of the university. And in looking at everything from the department chairs all the way up to the president, so maybe we're talking 50, 75 people on the stage, and to just see maybe one or two persons of color just was so disheartening to me. When you looked out in the graduating audience, many of the graduates were persons of color. And so while that has changed since I left, and that was 2014, now that particular university has a president that is a person of color. And that was progress. I'm not really sure what the demographics now of the faculty and staff and the leadership, but I certainly believe that that's a step in the right direction. So the other thing about inclusion, so are we also including vulnerable populations? So for example, LGBTQ, do we have policies in place that are inclusive in terms of benefits? If we say we have benefits for heterosexuals, do we have the same benefits for those that are gay, lesbian? And so really looking at our policies, and this can be started, in human resources. When we say that we are an equitable institution, it also means equitable in terms of benefits as well. So let's look at some strategies, some transformative strategies, if we will. First of all, let's look at the title, Cultural Humility, and what it is that we mean by cultural humility. Cultural humility, in terms of the National Institute of Health, they define it as a lifelong process of self-reflection and self-critique, whereby the individual not only learns about another's culture, but one starts with an examination of his or her own beliefs and cultural identity. I think that's fairly comprehensive. And it really puts the onus on the individual. We all come to the table with a certain amount of bias. I'll talk a little bit about my own bias and how I dealt with that. But until we confront our own biases and our own populations that we may have a difficult time working with for whatever reason, at least we should start there. And so again, it's a lifelong commitment to learning and self-reflection, but also it's also assessing and looking at power imbalances within the student, faculty, administrator dynamic. And also, most salient, institutional accountability. So if we say that we are an institution that's diverse, that's equitable, inclusive, is that reflected in our data? Is it reflected in our policies? Is it reflected in our media messages? Is it reflected, particularly in higher education and doing research? Does our research reflect that as well? Or are we still going into communities as a savior with the savior complex and not involving the community in the research process and in decision-making in terms of our research? So one of the things I wanted to just introduce you to, for some, and others probably already know this, this is what we call the addressing framework. And this was developed by Pamela Hayes. And I think it's just phenomenal as a tool that we can begin to use organizationally to, again, not only identify our own biases, but, an exercise that we can share with our staff and our faculty and our employee. So Dr. Hayes looks at 10 general areas that are impactful in our day-to-day work. Now, certainly these are not all inclusive, but the word addressing sort of stands for each one of these domain areas. So number one, we've got age as one area. We've got developmental disabilities as well as acquired disabilities as another area. We've got religion and spirituality. We've got ethnic and racial identity, social economic status, sexual orientation, indigenous heritage, national origin, and gender. So these are sort of areas that we come in contact with on a daily basis. Most of us do, that areas where we may have privilege or areas where we may not have privilege. We can look at those populations that we may have difficulty working with and address those within ourselves. So just look at the worksheet and how this is further expanded. So if you look on the right-hand side, and you'll see an example of this addressing model. And again, we can use the chat if you want to sort of see where you fit here. So under partially completed example, you'll see, for example, one example is age. It's the second box. And look at how you identify, what is your age? And look at, again, implications for your work. Consider where you have privilege and what groups might be easy or difficult to work with. And I really have to put myself in this age box. I really do. And I'm no longer middle age. I'm actually a senior citizen now. I'm going on 70 years old. But I would have, so this particular person says, I would have difficulty working with children and young adults, 15 to 20. I realize I'm too verbal in my therapy approach and appreciate clients who can have discussions involving complex concepts. So this individual really has articulated and, been introspective in such that, they're saying, I would have a difficult time working with this population. And I also must put myself there because I would have a difficult time working with a population, let's say 12 to 18 would be maybe 12 to 16 would be a difficult population for me. And that's one reason why I stay out of K through 12 and mostly teach higher education, because my patience, comes into question here, and, just my tolerance as well. So I don't normally, but there are times when I do have to be aware of these shortcomings. So for example, as a respiratory therapist, I literally work at a children's healthcare. And so in higher education, I would have a problem, but I don't have a problem working with and dealing with sick children. I really love children. I've been a respiratory therapist 45 years, and pediatrics is my specialty. And so just really, really knowing where you may have a shortcoming or where you may have difficulty is very, very important. And so if anyone wants to put something in the chat to really address maybe some of your own shortcomings, please let me know, and we can ever come back to that if there's Nothing right now in the chat. Do we have anything right now? Dr. Daniels?
Currently, we do not have anything in the chat.
Okay, great. So we'll move along, and if there's anything as we move forward.
Well, we do have something in the chat, so I'm sorry.
Okay, come on with it. Come on with it.
Yeah, and that's Kelly. Kelly, would you like to come off mute?
Sure. I was saying that my daughter is 16, so she's a Gen Zer. So it's just really, I had her at an older age in my 30s. So it's really challenging dealing with, every generation is different, but this generation has had more, challenges, I would say. Well, I shouldn't say more challenges, but it's just a different world in terms of technology. The bullying that goes on, through social media, just a lot of the information they get through TikTok, and it's just it's completely different, I think, for what my mother had to deal with. And then I also teach college students that range from like 17 to 65. One of my oldest students was 65. So I can tell how annoying the Gen Zers are to my older students. And this semester has really I've had to journal like every day, because dealing with them, it gets worse and worse. And I think after the pandemic, it's even worse in terms of, everything's about themselves, and they don't have time, they're busy, but they're trying to get a degree, but they're too busy to do the work, and so the older students are like, please don't put me in a group with them, blah, blah, that kind of thing. So yeah, I have issues now. I think I have a strong bias, even though I like working with them, kind of dealing with it and trying to navigate through it. I think I do have a bias. If you asked me if I really wanted to work with that age group, a Gen Zer, I would say no, if I had a choice.
Great. And thank you so much.
Was that a too long answer?
And I'm with you. I'm right with you on that. So, but there are some people who that is their passion. They do a great, and I just admire those people. And here's the other thing. Like, we have got to continue to encourage and inspire our colleagues. That's part of my personal growth and development, because oftentimes this work, particularly when we're talking about youth, can be thankless. It can be daunting and really can be overwhelming at times. But just a thank you, I appreciate what you're doing, and continue to do it, and I want to encourage you. So those kinds of things really goes a long way. So thank you for that. So let's look at some key strategies for higher education. First of all, when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, there's got to be a commitment from leadership, not just in word, but in resources, as well as exemplifying what it is that we say we're about in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Secondly, data. We've got to know where we're at in order to move forward. And not just data, but stratified data. So if we're in an organization, we need to know how many African Americans we have, how many Latino, how many Asian, stratify our data so we'll know where we're falling short. Also, particularly in higher education, we've got to make sure that our student voices are being heard. What are their concerns? So just in my journey, one of our biggest concerns, particularly in my graduate studies in public health, I have a master's in public health, but we were, I was at an Ivy League, white, mostly university, and a public health department who, of all of the staff, there were maybe 2 or 3 persons of color. So one of our biggest issues was we want someone that reflects and looks like who we are. And so it's with that, as well as other issues, that we had to develop the Black Caucus, which was a university-wide African-American group, an organization that really had to fight for our rights in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion. And the other thing that's important is for us to really look at what we stand for. So when looking at our website, a website oftentimes are the first things that our clients or individuals look at or students look at before they even go to a university. You know, what do the images look like on your website? Do they reflect the population? Are there BIPOC images, you know, on your website? Is it interactive? And also, what about things like your mission statement? Is your mission statement such that it is an inclusive mission statement that clearly states that diversity, equity, inclusion is one of your values? And so again, the mission statement is one of the procedures or policies that can be revamped to really reflect more inclusive, more equitable, and more diverse language. And also leadership behavior. We know that it's one thing to say that we're diverse, but there's another thing in terms of exemplifying behavior. And again, policies as well as activities, as well as commitment starts at the top. And so the leadership really does have to reflect the values that they say that they have in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion. And again, looking at particularly in higher education, equity in tenure and promotion. And when we look at overall, so for example, according to the Center for Education Statistics, and this is national data, Black faculty comprise only 6% of all faculty, yet we comprise 13% of the population. So overall, it can be stated, and the literature backs this up, that there is a lack of BIPOC as well as African-American faculty, but particularly African-American males in academia. And so let's go a little bit deeper. So again, one of the things that then becomes paramount in terms of some of the activities is ongoing training. So we seek out trainings and ways to engage in doing the work. And so for example, our department at Kennesaw State University, our trainings are fairly comprehensive and expansive, and they're ongoing. So it's not just that we do a diversity, equity, inclusion training once a year. No, these are ongoing kinds of activities. So the first thing that we did within our committee is we had a speaker series, and everybody on the committee was part of a panel, which was about 7 or 8 sessions that really talked about diversity, equity, inclusion, but also talked about how, as a large university state system, how we can become more diverse and equitable. And these are, for example, again, each department had to have their own diversity, equity, and inclusion committee. And some of those committees were doing prolific work, phenomenal work. And so we want to bring all of these, not just the things that we're not doing well or that we need improvement, but where are our strengths, really capitalizing on our strengths. And also not just the workplace, but really bringing this into our family as well as our friends circle. And so again, let's look at leadership and understanding that there is a responsibility in terms of leadership to make a commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, as well as putting the resources in place so that individuals who are, for example, a part of these committees, first of all, are being paid for. Second of all, that are being provided and allocated time to be able to participate. Because what we were finding in many of the committees within the institutions, particularly faculty that are tenure track, they had to sort of add this into an already busy schedule, which really did not provide the kind of quality diversity, equity, inclusion services that were necessary. And so we really, really made a concerted effort that these persons that are on the committee are being paid for being on the committee, but also given the time also to be on these committees. So again, let's look at some higher education strategies. So again, we're looking at not only leadership, but we're also looking at students and making sure student voices are being heard in terms of what they need. How can they be successful? What are the things that faculty and administrators can do in order for students to be more successful? And what are faculty and staff needs? And are policies and procedures within the institution being, are they fair and are they equitable? So let's look at examples of leadership in action. What are some of the questions that leaders can ask? Number one, does the demographic makeup of our university reflect those we serve? Answer, yes or no. Look at the data. Look at the segmentation. Look at the stratification. Are we assessing the organizational climate and staff sense of belonging? Are we really doing things like surveys to really assess where people may feel that they're not getting what they need? And these can be anonymous. At the hospital, we do this all the time. An employee sort of survey, employee satisfaction survey, actually. So we can also do this in higher education. Also, actively investing in leadership pathways for underrepresented or BIPOC staff. And so here's the other thing too. In many of the universities, a large part of the staff are adjunct or part-time faculty. So in all fairness, do the part-time faculty or adjunct have a fair opportunity when, for example, full-time positions become available? Do they have access to when these positions become available, what they require, those kinds of things? And are you really looking at including not just external recruitment, but also recruitment from within your own ranks? Those individuals who have been with the university for years and contribute to the overall success of the university, are you also reaching out to them in terms of when new positions become available? And also, are we assessing our recruitment policies and practices? That idea that we just can't find qualified BIPOC persons no longer can be accepted, because there are innovative ways of reaching out to BIPOC persons. We've got, for example, Data People is a great a third-party organization whose focal area is to find and look where there are BIPOC qualified individuals. Are you reaching out to HBCUs and things like that? And so again, when we talk about really having a representative sample within our department, we really do have to move beyond. And if the human resources can't do it, they don't have the resources or the the qualifications to do that, then really sort of send it out to perhaps a third party whose focal area is recruitment. So again, the last few slides, and let's see how we're doing with time. So yeah, we got about 5-10 more minutes. And so here, in terms of being an anti-racist leader, the important thing here, because we talked about most of this already, but again, analyzing policies and re-examining organizational policies and procedures are absolutely imperative in order for us to move forward with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And these next couple of slides, I just want to talk a little bit about our committee. And one of the first things that we did in our committee is to do a strategic plan. For some reason, it looks like I lost. Hold on 1 second. I'm going to stop the share for a minute because it looks like I lost the PowerPoint. Okay, let's do the share again. Okay, here we go. And so in this report, one of the first things that we looked at is we looked at the data, and we found that in terms of faculty position and assistant professors, 36 were white. This is in our college. This is not the whole university. This is in the Wellstar College itself. So there were 36 white, 2 Asians, 2 Hispanic, and 10 blacks. So obviously this data says that there's a problem somewhere when 59% of the student body in this college was persons of color. Let's look at the associate professors: 11 white, 1 Hispanic, 1 black. Full professor: 6 whites, 3 Asians, 1 black. We have a lot of work to do in terms of having a representative sample within our organization. And so the other thing that we did is we came up with some recommendations, and I'll just name a few here. But one is recommended that all hiring committees be reminded of the importance of inclusive practice, but not only be reminded. We went further to say that the hiring committees, first of all, they reflect a diverse committee, but also that they be trained in diversity, equity, and inclusion practices before they go out and hire another person. But also that there be an external oversight in terms of the practices of the committee. So this idea that, well, we already know who we're going to hire and we're just going to go through the process of diversity, equity, and inclusion. No, there will be an external body that really looks at the practices and look at how this particular person was actually hired. And also recent P&T decisions. Look at what went into those decisions and assessing whether or not they were equitable. So again, these last couple of slides, and we really already went over examining policies, but again, the other idea is identifying and addressing microaggressions. And so, for example, when you're looking at your policies around dress, that kind of a thing, is it equitable? Or is it sort of marginalizing people based on their appearance and based on their dress? So last couple of slides. What are some recruitment best? Name a couple, but again, educating the hiring managers on diversity, equity, and inclusion, very, very important. Rewrite all job postings to reflect diversity values. And also very, very important, diversity and inclusion measurements. We've got to do, and we call this a continuous quality improvement, which means we are continually measuring how well we are doing, what we are doing well, but also what are the gaps that we still, obviously within our university, our college, there are many gaps in terms of associate professor and full professor. So we've got to immediately begin to address those shortcomings. But looking at, graphically, how well we're doing, are we making progress, or are we falling behind? And lastly, I think I have one more slide after this, but in really advocating for diversity, equity, and inclusion for our universities, there are benefits of diversification. Number one, a diverse workforce outperforms, and this is backed up by literature, outperforms an average workforce by 25%. Diversity increases employee engagement. And here it is, it reduces the cost of turnover. Well, it reduces your cost, the overall cost, because turnover is lower. Let me just tell you what it costs to bring on for example, a full-time faculty. We're looking at upwards of between $10,000 and $13,000. So to bring somebody on that in 3 or 4 months, or even in a year, that's dissatisfied, that is very, very costly. And so you really, really want to make sure that you are assessing satisfaction in terms of our faculty as well as our staff. And also, again, this last bullet point, diversity improves communication and awareness between employees, and employees are happier if they're engaged. And so one last slide that I just want to kind of touch on, because there's a trend across the United States where students, particularly in sync with the Black Lives Matter protest, they are demanding that controversial buildings and names of structures within university that represent racist ideology, that they be dismantled. And so you've got students, staff, faculty, and alumni of Townsend University in Maryland gathered in 2022 to celebrate the renaming of 2 dormitories that had these racist names to them, and they changed their names. And now one is called Barnes Hall and the other Harris Hall. So you see how these student-led movements are beginning to trend in terms of changing conversations and changing dynamics, because again, we're just no longer willing to be a part of structures that represents racist ideologies. And there we go. I think we've got even a few more minutes for questions and answers, but here is my information. You can take a snapshot. I am CEO of Passion and Purpose Consultants, and so I do consulting in a variety of different areas around diversity, equity, inclusion, around substance use disorder at the intersection of HIV, strategic planning. So yeah, you'll get an opportunity to really, have me to come and do a presentation for your organization in those areas. And so my also am part-time faculty at Capella University, and this is my Capella email, lawrence.bryan@capella.edu. And so just shoot me an email and we can have a conversation. And with that, we do have time for a few questions. And you can put your questions in the chat, or you can come off of mute. And if there's any questions, and also be sure to click on the evaluation link, which is in the chat, so that we can know how we can improve our presentation skills, look at where we may have fallen short, and look at what we did really well. So please make sure that you do that. And
So,
I want to thank
Brian,
yeah.
I'm just going to take the moment here to ask a quick question. You mentioned leadership buy-in in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. What happens if you don't have that buy-in? How can you, as an individual, sort of motivate or encourage or generate that buy-in and roll it up to the top? Is that possible?
That's a great question. And one of the things that at least we try to do is first identify those benefits of having a diverse equity and inclusion, and really bring in data that really supports that the bottom line is actually increased in terms of dollar when an organization is more diverse. But also, particularly in higher education, one thing that impacts leadership is student advocacy. And particularly where we really have impacted leadership within organizations is in alumni. We've had to really, particularly at my graduate university, we really have had to take leadership to task, and professors to task who were, spreading sort of racist ideology. We've taken them to task, and we have changed policies, and we've had some professors to actually be, be dismissed from the university because of those practices. And so, these are some of the ways that we can begin to convince leadership and management that it's in their best interest to promote diversity, equity, inclusion. But again, there's nothing more powerful than the students who say we want change.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Any more questions?
I have a question.
Okay.
So I've been working in higher ed for a very long, almost 2 decades now, and I never see any efforts to educate faculty on the different, I guess what was that called? Addressing framework?
Yes.
To educate us on, we did just have an accessibility workshop. I'll give them that credit recently because they know they can be sued. A lot of universities are being sued for that in terms of not, making courses accessible and doing, right by students with exceptionalities. But I don't see any effort to educate. Just talking about our Gen Z students, like really understanding them and helping us to serve them better. So do you know of any universities that actually implement programs in which they address those different categories or, train faculty on how to better serve people and not have those biases and all of that, and to deal with those biases, I should say?
Well, there are universities that are doing that. And I have to say that the university that I work with, being on the DEI committee, and one of the reasons why I'm part of the DEI committee and part of the wider university diversity and inclusion excellence is because of my own personal experience around racism, around not feeling inclusive. So for example, so I've been teaching part-time for maybe 2 or 3 years at the university. And so a position became available, and they actually did put the position on the department email. And so I actually applied for the position, and I know I was well qualified for it. And I didn't even, myself and 2 or 3 other people who are BIPOC persons also applied, and not one of us even got so much as even an interview. And so I, brought this to their attention, and they really didn't have any good excuse because the person that they ultimately hired was someone who didn't have near the qualifications, was not a person of color, and certainly did not represent the experiences that all 3 of us as adjunct faculty actually had. And so, that was an example of those kinds of issues that we have. And so those are experiences that I bring to the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee and to the larger diversity committee, because even at that time when this happened, they had a diversity, equity, inclusion department who was impotent to do anything. We brought this to their attention and they didn't even respond back to us, which was very frustrating. And so I share those experiences as, someone who's really been there and been in the trenches in terms of, really feeling left out and really being overlooked, as one of the reasons why those statistics that I shared with you within the university are so daunting, particularly around assistant tenure track professors. And so again, now these policies that involve the input of persons like myself and persons from other departments who've had those experiences. Now, again, one of the things that we've instituted is that there is an oversight to these selection committees, number one. Number two, that they have to be trained. And in that training, we'll talk about some of our lived experiences around race and racism. And we'll share with them what the demographics are of the student faculty as opposed to our goals and where we would like to go. So I think we're starting in the right direction, and the work plan that I shared with you is something that we brought to the dean. And fortunately for our department, the dean has buy-in, not only just in terms of word, but in terms of resources. She gave us a $4,000 or $5,000 to bring a speaker in on diversity, equity, inclusion. So, once we get at least buy-in from the top, it just becomes more easier to implement these policies.
Thank you.
Sure. And I think we're a little bit over, so I'll turn this back over. Thank you all for being here, and I'll turn it back over to the illustrious Dr. Daniels.
Right, Dr. Bryant, really want to thank you for this informative and insightful presentation. Really enjoyed all you had to say today. I'm sure we learned a lot, and we can apply your learnings to our day-to-day professional lives. So again, thank you very much for all that you've shared today. We appreciate your time. And also want to say to all of our participants, to the attendees, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us today. And please remember to complete the survey. The link to the survey is in the chat. So have a wonderful day. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.